What is it ultimately about the trialing and testing that speaks to you more so than the hunting just by itself?
For someone coming in as a new person, I think it can be easier to get into a community with a trialing group or testing group and have that support kind of right away. Because if you didn't grow up hunting like I didn't, how are you going to meet a hunting community? Whereas if you show up to a hunt test or a NAVTA training day, it's a little bit easier to get hooked in, I think. One of the other really things that I like about testing and trialing is it gives you very clear goals. If you're going to train for especially any of the upper level tests, there's very specific things that you need to do with your dog. And if you're training for hunting, like you can train your dog to be steady to wing, shot, and fall, and retrieve to hand, and back the brace mates, and all sorts of things. But, when you have a judge judging on those things, like the bar is set, So for me, I'm very goal oriented. Like I need a deadline or I need something to kind of motivate me to work on that kind of stuff. If I was just training for hunting, I don't think I would have done half the stuff I did with Zara.
All right, everybody. We are sitting here with the accidental bird dog lady herself, TerryAnn Fernando. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
For those that may not be familiar with who you are, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and kind of tell everybody a little bit more context around the accidental bird dog?
Sure. I'll try to keep it relatively brief. So I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I have a 10-year-old Vizsla named Zara, who I originally got as a pet. And long story short, she didn't show any interest in hunting when she was a puppy. She is from field trial line, so she had that genetics there, but just I had no interest in hunting. My husband didn't. She didn't. So, we just got her as a running partner. And then a couple years later, my breeder suggested entering a junior hunter test with her. We did a little bit of exposure on quail, and then we went to this hunt test, and she just did amazing. So that was kind of the beginning of me being like, oh, okay, this dog actually has some talent. Maybe I should do something with this. And then I decided to do something with it and kind of went down a rabbit hole. And now, 8 years later, I'm pretty much all in on bird dog stuff and, have a whole accidental bird dog brand. And I have a 7-year-old Rhodesian Ridgeback named Columbo, who's he does some sports, but he is more of a pet dog. And then I just got another Vizsla puppy who's named Lanka. She's almost 4 months old.
So aside from the breeder obviously helping you out, your first exposure into the gun dog world was a hunt test, a junior hunt test. And then fast forward, you had a good experience with that. You saw at least the dog and how she enjoyed it, and you wanted to explore that. Here you are a few years later with your second dog, and lo and behold, a good positive initial impression for somebody brand new going to hunt test results in you sticking around and kind of going pretty deep into the space with your own brand, your own podcast, everything.
Yep.
What was it like? Do you remember showing up to that first hunt test and like just the feeling, the intimidation maybe? Like what was going through your head? Do you remember that?
So honestly, for that first hunt test, I don't remember being super intimidated. And I think it was because I had just really low expectations and my breeder was there. So I felt like, it wasn't me going alone. Later, like when I went to NAVTA and stuff, I felt very intimidated there. But at that hunt test, I don't remember being that intimidated because I had the support of my breeder.
Mhm.
But I do remember being there and just like really having no idea what we were going to be doing, or like I had no idea of the rules. People were like, oh, they're judged in these different categories. And I was like, oh, there's categories. So I think I was in a very good headspace in the sense that like if it had gone really wrong and she hadn't had any interest, I would have been like, okay, like we'll move on.
Mhm.
So yeah, it was kind of a little bit weird of a situation there.
Do you think that experience spoke to you so much because you went in with no expectations? Would you advise somebody else go into it with knowing nothing, just show up and go for the ride? Or would you advise somebody like, prepare a little bit, like at least look at the rule book once or twice?
Yeah, I think you definitely need to prepare some, because if you're going to any event that involves gunfire, you need to make sure your dog is properly gun acclimated.
Fair.
And I had, we had done that with Zara. She'd had some exposure beforehand. So if you're going to compete, at least, you could come to spectate without a dog, obviously. But yeah, I don't know. I think I think it's good to have low expectations, but it's you got to start somewhere.
Yeah. Well, we're here. You're coming through Nashville for some other life things, and so we linked up real quick out here at my old stomping grounds and training grounds here outside of Nashville. And I wanted to talk to you because you recently, a couple months ago, a few weeks ago, what have you, did an episode on your own podcast talking about the differences between hunt tests and trials and hunting. And I thought it was really interesting, and I gave it a listen. And a lot of what you're saying like resonated with me in a few different ways because what you're just talking about, your first experience was through the hunt test lens. My first experience and desire through this was through hunting.
Hmm.
And more or less because you're in North Carolina, I'm in Tennessee, there's kind of obviously a regional commonality between us to where we don't have the most opportunistic hunting options here. So it's kind of steered me into exploring the field trial and the games section a little bit more. But I find it interesting that like you started out in that world and that was like your main focus. That's what you enjoyed and you've since then tried hunting, but I wanted to kind of have a little bit more in-depth discussion on this topic with you. For everybody that's unfamiliar with kind of your resume, so to speak, you've kind of trialed and tested at a higher degree than even I have up until this point. So, what is it ultimately about the trialing and testing that speaks to you more so than the hunting just by itself?
I mean, there's a lot of different things, I think. But um I think, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of different points. I mean, one is the community. I think for someone coming in as a new person, I think it can be easier to get into a community with a trialing group or testing group, and have that support kind of right away. Whereas, because if you didn't grow up hunting like I didn't, you're new to bird dogs, how are you going to meet a hunting community, right? Like, maybe your Department of Natural Resources has an intro to hunting event and you go there and you meet people, but or maybe you know some friend of a friend who's going to take you hunting, but otherwise, like, where do you meet people? So whereas if you show up to a hunt test or a NAVTA training day or a club that has a training day, you're kind of it's a little bit easier to get hooked in, I think. And obviously I built friendships and stuff through those communities, so that's important to me. One of the other really things that I like about testing and trialing is it gives you very clear goals. So if you're going to train for especially any of the upper level tests, there's very specific things that you need to do with your dog. And if you're training for hunting, like, you can train your dog to be steady to wing, shot, and fall, and retrieve to hand, and back the brace mates, and all sorts of things. But I just think, when you have a judge judging on those things, like, the bar is set. So for me, I'm very goal oriented. Like, I need a deadline or I need something to kind of motivate me to work on that kind of stuff. If I was just training for hunting, I don't think I would have done half the stuff I did with Zara because there would have been no real reason for it and there was no deadline.
And I think both are fair points. And I want to stick on the goals first, but then I want to circle back and come back to the community. The goals, it's really interesting is when I first got into this again, I came through it to where I wanted the world's best hunting dog, the perfect hunting dog. And at the time I thought that you got into it and you needed all of those skill sets that NAVDA espouses or any of these hunt tests and trials. And then come to find out, like, a lot of the best just meat dogs, the hunting dogs, the ones that you drop on the ground and like in the hunting field, you're like, man, that dog really knows his job. It's almost more or less just genetics and exposure. It's
Hmm.
almost like the people with those dogs that truly only care about hunting. It's like they don't really have much training involved. It's like they
Yeah.
just go out and they just let it unfold and go through it. I mean, they may teach whoa, they may do some small things, but the testing and trialing community, it definitely, if part of the thing that the draw that brings you to this world is the dogs, to your point that you almost have to go to the trial and testing area to find it. But I find it interesting that throughout that process, while some people are developing their dogs, they almost lose some of the hunt in their dog. And
Sure.
so it's almost like by getting the quote unquote like groomed, trained, high level dog, it's almost like you lose the actual hunting element of the dog. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent. I mean, I think it really depends on the person and the dog. And
Hmm.
I mean, there's plenty of people that compete, like myself and you and others that also hunt. There's just because someone tests and trials doesn't mean they don't hunt, or vice versa. Although I know plenty of people that compete and they really don't hunt.
Hmm.
That's just something they don't do. So, but I think a lot of people probably, if they do are really into tests and trials and they compete at the upper levels, I think when they go hunting, the context is a little different. I think, not to speak for other people, but I think they probably have somewhat different rules, I'm guessing. For me, I know I've kind of fallen into that by accident. Like we hunt primarily woodcock in North Carolina. That's the main bird we have there. When I first started hunting, Zara was steady to wing shot and fall on woodcock, but that quickly eroded.
Yeah.
Now she'll break it to flush.
Yep.
But on pen raised birds, she's steady. So I personally, and this is something I'm going to try to do differently with the next dog, is to enforce the rules a little bit more. But I think when you're hunting, it's so easy to not enforce those rules.
Yeah.
Just because things are happening so fast. If you're also trying to shoot and there's other people involved, it's just hard to be, oh, my dog took a step, like I'm not going to shoot. It's
Yeah. You don't start recognizing things like that unless you do both. And this kind of goes both ways to where you have people that only hunt and they don't test or trial, but then they'll pass judgment on the people that test and trial and say that, oh, their dogs can't hunt. Then vice versa, you have the people that, some people that do the testing and trialing and they're just, they look down at the, blue collar guy down the road that just wants to hunt and he doesn't really have any flashy obedience, but you know what, that dog will go produce more birds than their trial dog. Then I think the majority of the people kind of end up in the middle of
yeah,
all that, to where I think that the majority of the people that come into the space that does, let's just say, nabbed and hunt test, they will go do hunting as well. So they kind of want a little bit both sides of it. But until you're in that element, you don't recognize that we can train this dog to a super high level and degree here in the training field. Rachel's the same way, to where I can go place and plant some birds out there with launchers, whatever,
hmm
and she's going to be completely steady. You go put her in the grouse woods, that bird's coming up and she's breaking.
yeah,
And you just kind of have to decide, do you care about that or not? Like, what is your priority? Is your priority more about the trial and testing, or is it about the hunting? Or to what we just talked about, you can kind of just do both, and the dogs kind of figure out that they're smart enough to recognize that this one's a game over here and this one's actually hunting.
yeah. And I have seen that with my own dog. I mean, part of me wonders if I'm losing something there, like losing something, for example, on the steadiness end by letting her be not steady on wild birds. But honestly, I really haven't. Like I've been able to run her in a field trial in the middle of hunting season, and she's been fine.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, everyone talks about in dog training how dogs are very context specific. So I think the dogs can tell the difference between, especially like at a field trial. There's horses, like you're running big versus like we're going to the woods to hunt woodcock.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, when you're talking about a trial or test, you're playing the game in dirty fields. There's old scent, there's four-wheeler scent, horse scent, other dogs, other people. You can't tell me that the dogs don't pick up on that. It goes into what I talk about. I've said it a few times in recent episodes. Is like, is your dog really as smart as you claim they are, or are they not? Because if I go drop my dog in the woods, they know the difference between woods that people have already gone through, a bunch of other dogs, horses, four wheelers, whatever, and woods that are just completely clean, and they have to go smell a bird, right?
Yeah.
If they can smell, a 6 ounce bird in the middle of cover and stop on point, I'm pretty sure they can smell all of the other distractions or things that came beforehand. I think they can delineate the difference between a training field and an actual hunting field.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the more experienced the dog is, the better they are at that, right? If you have a 2-year-old dog that hasn't had a lot of maybe hunting experience or trialing experience or, one or the other, they might not be be able to tell the difference as clearly as like an 8-year-old that's been doing both their whole lives, for example.
Yeah, the experience is a huge thing, regardless of which angle you're coming at this from, on which your preference is. I, for one, this kind of starts going into the community side of things or the cultural side of things. If we only wanted to be like a wild bird hunter, there's really no feasible way to do that and get the experience that we're wanting from our dogs, right? Like, we can go sign up for the games, we can go sign up for the tests and trials, and they can gain that experience. But getting experience on wild birds is pretty hard to do down here in this area because the southeast is really you have little spots of bobwhite left over, but aside from those little small hot spots of bobwhite, we don't have another actual home bird, native bird. We have migratory woodcock that come through,
Right.
snipe come through, but unless you can go get on Bob Whites, and even those little small hot spots, they're not enough to really bring out the hunt in them. And so, if we talk about community and a culture down here in the South, if you lose the trials and the tests, we kind of almost lose the entire bird dog culture as a whole. Like, we're not that far off, generationally speaking,
Yeah.
from losing that if we wanted to, harken back to the good old days and prefer hunting dogs over trial or testing dogs.
Yeah, and I mean, I think like I know so many people or I've met people that get into hunting through trialing and testing, right? So I think you need that. If you don't have that avenue, then hunting goes away real quick.
Yeah.
Um, just talking about like the learning curve for new people for hunting. I mean, like when you're new, it's hard for me to even think about this now, but like before I started hunting and before I got really involved in NAVDA and some of the other organizations, like you don't even know, like you just don't know anything. Like again, if you don't grow up hunting, you don't have any friends that hunt or whatever. Like I didn't even know game lands and public land existed, first of all. Like that sounds crazy to me to say that now. Like I have game lands 10 minutes from my house. I didn't know that was a thing. I had no interest in carrying a gun and like was very intimidated by that. And just the fact like I didn't know where to look for seasons. Like, how do you know what a bird looks like? I mean, is it safe to go out and be around other people? Are they hunting? Like, are there going to be other dogs? I mean, I think just the barrier to entry, unless you're someone that's like really gung ho, like I'm just going to go out there and you're really confident. Um, I don't know. I just think it's really intimidating.
Well, and the less people that come into this, the smaller the community and culture gets, the harder that's even going to become to break new people into it, right? We talk about the value of mentors and everything. There's really not a whole lot of mentors down here,
Hmm.
hunting wise.
Yeah.
There are still some people that, if you want to get involved in NAVDA, AKC, fill in the blank, NASTRA, whatever, people will kind of bring you in and teach you that. But when it comes into new people getting into hunting, not only is it hard to find the people that will actually take the time to take you out and mentor you, where are you going to go? On your first hunt trip, are you really going to load up and drive 10, 12 hours to the Northwoods and chase grouse? Or are you going to drive 12, 15 hours out west to go chase, bobwhite quail in Kansas or Oklahoma, right? Like it really kind of puts you in a precarious position to where even if you want to get involved, you kind of have to go from level 0 to level 10 to really take that next step. And so you're a perfect example of, you went to a hunt test. Now here you are, you've done the hunting and you're involved. But the average person that just throws up their hand and be like, "Hey, I want to be an upland hunter," unless the preserve is what you want to do, there's really not too many options for you.
Yeah, because you got to know what the habitat looks like, right? So, I mean, that's a whole learning curve in itself. Because if you go out 10 times, you never find any birds, like you're going to get frustrated and probably stop, right? I mean, you want your dog, I mean, your dog's going to have fun regardless, but
Right. They're gonna run, and yeah.
they'll be tired, which is what you want. But um, yeah, it's going to get a little discouraging. And that's another reason I think tests and trials or training with pen raised birds is something that I prioritize because it's like, even during hunting seasons, like, okay, I could go out and we may find birds, or I could go to a trial and we will find birds.
Right.
It's a guarantee.
Well,
So,
I'm that crazy person that did just go, right? Like you were talking about, the if unless you're just one of those people that just goes and figures it out as you go along, that's more or less kind of what I did. That's like, I think this is cool, I'm going to do it. Not everybody's going to have that mentality, especially we talk about, like, there's different seasons in life. I got into the bird dog stuff. This was, I got my first bird dog like right before I got married, and definitely before I had a child. I was more willing to sacrifice an entire weekend to drive 4 or 5 hours at maybe one grouse flush a weekend.
Mm-hmm.
To your point, we're all busy. We all have lives. We all have jobs, family, responsibilities, whatever. It's hard to justify going out there to just say, I'm hunting wild birds, but the chances of actually gaining anything in terms of dog work or even a successful hunt, it's hard to justify that when it's like, hey, I can just go play this game over here and have fun. The dog enjoys it. We get something out of it. Like I can still work and train my dog and develop them. I'm finding myself to where a few years ago I probably have been like, nope, go wild bird hunting. Like you got a bird dog, go treat it like a bird dog. But now, now that I different seasons in life, I have a kid and so much stuff to do. I can't just go check out for a weekend and maybe get a flush all weekend.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not realistic to do, and you can't really fault other people for doing that. So anybody that's just like, oh dang preserve hunters or dang, trial they only trial or test, like, well, yeah, but that's also how you still keep the community alive because to what we were just talking about, if we lose that in the South, more than likely we're going to lose all hunting support. You just said you didn't even know there was public land here.
Yeah.
When we talk about growing and kind of fighting for habitat, we need public perception to be at least be in favor of hunting. And if you don't have hunters, that's not possible. Well, down here, I say that the most realistic way to get people involved is through the trial and testing game. At least down here, I don't think that's necessarily true in the other regions, but at least down here, I think that's accurate.
Yeah, but I think if say you live in Wisconsin, and you're brand new, I mean, I think going into tests and trials is totally legit because just going back to, if you're new, or like there's also safety considerations.
Yep.
If you're a woman, so, you're at I don't know, I mean, you have to be a little bit careful sometimes. You go out in the woods by yourself, you never know what you're going to find.
Yeah.
I mean, men too, but, I think women, it can be a little bit more
Yeah.
of a risk depending. So I think that can be intimidating for people. And like, I've talked to plenty of women too that get into tests and trials that they don't want to shoot. I mean, I'm sure men as well, but they're not comfortable shooting. So, you can go out and hunt with your dog and not carry a gun, but I don't know. I know when I first started, like that to me was not a possibility. It was like I wouldn't have thought to do that. I guess that sounds weird, but it's like, I don't know. I guess I thought if you're going to hunt, you have to carry a gun. So maybe that's just me, but I think the nice thing about a test and a trial is you can go there, and if there's retrieving involved, you have a lot of them, most, probably majority, I'd say, they have official gunners. You're not allowed to shoot. Now, some do, NASTRA and etc.
Yeah.
But so if you're not comfortable carrying a gun, you can go to one of these events or training day and you can have people shoot for your dog, and maybe you become more comfortable over time. So I think that's value as well.
Yeah. And even like the horseback, like you were honestly one of the first ones that clued me into this. Even the horseback trials, you don't have to have a horse. So if you're intimidated or you're looking at it like I don't have a horse, you can enter in as a walker
Mm-hmm.
in those trials. Have you done that yourself?
Oh yeah, I have never ridden a horse in AK. When I've done AKC field trials, I probably, I don't know the exact split, but I primarily compete in horseback stakes. It's more so than walking because there's just more horseback stakes than walking stakes in general. I've always walked because you're allowed. You're all, they ask you to note it on your entry form, and they typically, if there is another walking handler, they'll pair you guys together. But yeah, you can always walk.
Mm.
So
How has that felt like going in there? If you're say if there's another walker, cool, they pair you together. But if there's not another walker, how's that feel like you're starting at the breakaway and dude's over here on a horse and you're just like, all right, I'll see y'all here in a little bit.
So I'm probably a little bit of an anomaly because I like to walk fast. So I actually would rather be paired with a horseback handler because if I'm with a walking handler, you're supposed to stay together. Typically, the walking handler is not going to walk as fast as I would like to. So then I'm like constantly trying to be like, okay, you back there.
Right.
Whereas if I'm with a horseback handler, usually I'm trying to keep up with them so I can end up walking fast. I mean, the horses are supposed to be kept at what's called a flat walk. So, like, they're not supposed to be galloping along. Obviously, a horse's walking pace is probably faster than most people's walking pace. So, I think, hopefully you have an understanding brace made. And I've definitely been at trials where you see people, they're on horses that are like, oh, I'm paired with a walking person. Great. And they try to get split up.
Yeah.
You will naturally get split up a lot of times. So that's fine. But I've had a good experience overall. I've been able to be fine with it. But I think it depends on the person and if you're in decent walking shape.
Yeah, so I was recently just up in North Dakota, checked out the horseback trial there, and that was one of the questions I asked is like, how often do you guys get a walker? And they were like, yeah, you can do it. We wouldn't advise it, and you're just talking to them, and it's like they're like, it's a long course if you want to knock off 6 miles. And the brace that I did run with them, it was pretty lengthy, and I was like, I don't mind walking 6 miles. It is what it is. But when you're talking about having to do 6 miles in that time period, I'm like, that is kind of hoofing it quite a bit. So you have to go into it knowing that you're gonna get after it.
Was that an hour long event?
Yes.
Okay. So most of the events I'm competing are half hour.
Okay.
So it's a little more doable. And I think, yeah, out west, you're probably, I mean, again, if the horses are a flat walk, you should be theoretically covering the same amount of ground. But I think out there it's more open. Your dogs are probably running bigger and you end up having them farther away. So then you have to get up to them to find them on point. Whereas, like in the east, a lot of the places I compete, it's a little more wooded. The courses are a little more closed in. So maybe the dogs are not ranging as far and you're just not, I don't know. I think you're maybe not walking quite as much as out there.
Yeah. It's when it comes to field trialing and hunt tests, do you have a preference one way or the other, or do you just kind of recognize they're just kind of two different things?
Yeah, I think the more I've gotten into, so I did hunt tests and NAVDA, which are basically hunt tests first, and then I went to field trials. I really like field trials now because I am competitive and I do like that. I think the thing with field trials, it's kind of nice. It's a sport that you probably can continue to do longer versus the hunt test. So hunt tests, say you run an AKC hunt test, you have junior, senior, master. You get a master hunter title on your dog, which you could do. The dog's 2 years old, maybe 3. Then they have master hunter advanced and they have master hunter excellent now. But once you kind of check that box, there's really nowhere to go. Same with NAVDA. You do a utility test, maybe you go to the invitational, you pass the invitational, there's nothing left, right? Whereas field trials, there's always, because it's a competition, I think you can keep doing it. Most of the people that do field trials are primarily people that only do field trials, and they kind of compete over the career of their dog. So their dog starts running when they're a puppy, and they might run that dog till it's 7, 8, 9, 10, because then you can go to regional events, you can go to national championships. I think there's higher goals there that it gives you more to reach for versus the hunt tests.
Yeah.
I think hunt tests definitely have their place, and I will continue to do them. But for me, I've found the field trials to be something that I definitely enjoy.
Yeah. And when we're going back to the newbie, the new person stepping into this and feeling comfortable, generally speaking, have you noticed more of a, I don't know, accommodating or welcoming feeling at the hunt test as opposed to the field trials? Because me personally, like I came into it thinking, I assumed that the hunt test was just going to be, it's against the standard, right? Nobody's competing.
Mm-hmm.
But I've found, more or less just because technically they say you're not competing, there's plenty of people still competing, and that's fine. Like I'm not trying to squash that, but what I'm trying to get at is at least in the field trial world, it's like it's out in the open. It's to me, it feels a little bit more authentic. Like everybody knows that hey, you can talk all the junk over here, you still have to go out there and prove it. And to your point, like whether you're a competitive person or not, you're still just going out there and hoping that the dog performs the best they can, but at least you're going out with the understanding of like why everybody's here. Like what are we actually out here to do, as opposed to, people who are like, oh, it's against the standard, but meanwhile, like, behind closed doors, they're just as competitive as these field trialers over there.
I mean, I wouldn't say, I would say I found both communities to be welcoming, to be honest. You know, if you lump NAVDA in with hunt tests, I've in general found everyone in NAVDA to be very welcoming. So I can't exclude that. I wouldn't have stayed with NAVDA if that was not the case. Like people went out of their way to be
Mm-hmm.
welcoming to me. But yeah, I think you do hear people say, "Oh, field trials, everyone's so cutthroat or whatever." I have
Yeah.
not found that to be the case. I mean, most people are very nice and willing to help you. I mean, you got to show up and be like humble. I mean, don't rock up to your
Yeah.
first field trial and be like, "My dog's gonna win this
You're
thing."
mine. Yeah, and that's the point I was driving at is it wasn't so much to cast shade on the hunt test people saying that like they're being malicious or anything behind it. It's more to try and guys like don't be afraid of the field trial just because it's a
Yeah,
competition, right? Like they're just as opening and welcoming
yeah.
as the hunt test side. And I just find it interesting that when you do have people competing, that when the trial is on, yeah, they're out there to win. But I've found that just as much as the hunt test community outside, off the field, outside of the brace, once you sit down and break bread with people, like they're gonna try and help you and give you all the secrets and tips that they can, just like everybody else.
So in regards to people being, friendly at trials and stuff, I think people recognize, or at least I think about this. It's like you still, even if you want to win all the time, you have to have other people there to compete with. So I think people recognize that, you have to have that community, right? Like if you run everybody off, you're not going to have anyone to compete with. You're not going to have anyone at the trials, right? So I think, I don't know, this is just me kind of speculating, but I do think about like we need to bring new people in and you want to have quality competition, right? You don't, for me, like if I win a trial, but like all the other dogs didn't do very well, like,
Yeah.
does that really mean anything?
Yeah, because there's like trials that people place in, but when you talk to them and you get some of the backstory, it's like there was four dogs there.
Yeah,
Not to take anything
sure.
away from somebody, it's like you can only run against the competition that
Yeah.
shows up. But that is an interesting point to where they people at these trial systems they do have skin in the game to where if they just show up and all of a sudden all they do is meet you in the parking lot and start talking trash, they're not going to have anybody that wants to come play with them
Right.
essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean I've seen like especially well in the national events and in the local events too. I think most of the trial people, since they are doing it more like over the course of the life of their dog, I think they're in it longer a lot of times. Whereas with the hunt test, is like you title your one dog and then you go home and you don't necessarily come back. Like these people are in it for years, and it's just always the same people, right? Or it tends to be the same people. So you get to know those people. I think there is that sense of community, and people are pulling together, like they're wanting to put this trial on and have it be successful. But they are welcoming to new people too. And from what I've seen, there are a lot of older people, but being someone that's relatively young, I've had a lot of older people be like, "Oh, here's a younger person. Like, please stay,"
Yeah.
because they recognize like they're only going to be around for so long, so they want the
Yeah.
sport to continue.
Yeah, it's almost like when I show up to a trial and I'm not a spring chicken, but I'm definitely one of the younger guys there typically speaking. It's almost like they overcompensate. It's like they want you to like it so much. It's almost like, man, like just take a step back, like let me just enjoy what the dog thing is. But it comes from a good place, it comes from good intentions. But it's like I tell all of them, like really the best thing you can do to attract newer people is don't lower the standard, don't make it easier to succeed, make it easier and more efficient to figure out how to actually do it. It's like that's my biggest gripe is when I want to go play a game or enter a trial, you have all these hoops to jump through. Like you have to call this person to then mail this person to get the and it's like guys, this it's 2024 now. I understand that we come from a world of like tradition and we can respect that, but we need to freshen up some things to where if you're not using Venmo or a way to sign up for a trial online, that is a direct reason why younger people aren't going to jump through hoops to come join you. And that's something that like NAVDA has done a much better job
Hmm.
at doing. And I think that that is big, a paramount reason why a younger person might be more inclined to try something such as NAVDA rather than go to a field trial because let's face it, like as I get into this field trial world, I want to explore it more. I want to attend more trials. Finding the information and just how to go about entering, and not even just entering, but showing up to observe it. It's like, why is it so hard? Why is it pulling teeth to pull out this information just to find out where to go and what time to show up?
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit harder to get. And yeah, I mean, a lot of the clubs, depending who the secretary is, they're taking paper entry forms that are mailed with checks. And
Yeah.
I'm not super, I have a checkbook, but I rarely write checks and I'd rather not write a check. So if I could pay electronically, that's so much better.
Yeah.
Right? But if someone's 10 years younger than me or more, they might not have a checkbook.
Yeah. And it's one of those things that like you show up and genuinely these people have a vested interest in growing it and getting fresh people in the game, but they're always asking like, well, what can we do? And I'm like, that right there, just make it easy for people to know when and where a trial is and how to sign up. You don't have to adjust anything else. You don't have to lower the bar. You don't have to do any of that stuff. Just make it more likely that somebody's going to show up, because I know I'm that way. Like if I can't get to something in 2 or 3 clicks now, then it's just I'll go find something else to do.
Yeah, and I think from what I've seen, most field trial and hunt test clubs, or, this is talking probably primarily AKC clubs that put on field trials and hunt tests, a lot of them don't have websites. I mean, I guess some do, but a lot of them don't have updated websites. Whereas I think, like talking about NAVDA, the NAVDA chapters, most of them have a fairly updated website that has training, testing. Here's where we train. Here's where we test. Whereas a lot of the field trials, especially, like you can find out the location of the wildlife management area, but where on those thousands of acres are they meeting?
Yeah.
Right? It's a little harder to find.
Yeah, depending on which WMA you go at, it could be literally a half an hour, 45 minutes to the other side of the WMA. And then you don't want to be a nuisance. Like you don't want to be the person that calls and asks a million questions like, "Hey, how do I show up?" Me personally, like I'm kind of used to just showing up and not knowing anybody and raising my hand and feeling like a greenhorn. I don't feel comfortable doing it, but I'm okay with it. Some people are reluctant with that.
Mm-hmm.
Where I find my hesitancy is people are busy. Like I don't want to be bugging them with what I think is silly questions of, hey, where are we meeting and what time in the morning? But at the same time, like I feel that's information that should just be put out there. We shouldn't even have to go asking for it. Some chapters, some organizations are better at that than others. But I think that's, if field trialers are listening to this and they're like, you do have a vested interest in growing it, just that one simple step is, how can people find you? That right there.
Yeah, I think a lot of the times the information is on the premium, but it's kind of buried, and finding that premium can be hard.
And even sometimes the premiums, like if you read some of the premiums, it's like there's a lot of information that does not pertain to me
Yeah.
whatsoever. And if you don't have some sort of base foundational level knowledge of what some of the terminology means, is like, is
Yep.
this derby? Is this open age? Is this, all these little terms, to where like if you're unsure which section you're even supposed to be running in, and then you have to snail mail it in, and then somebody calls you and is like, "Hey, you got it wrong. Resend this."
Yeah.
It's just like that is kind of an aspect of, I'm not always the most modern guy out there, but that is one that I'm like, guys, 2024, we can do better.
Yeah, for sure.
So the hunting. Talk to me about, you said that when you first got into this, you weren't one to just feel comfortable, let's go do this, but you've been doing it since then. Have you become more comfortable in it, the more experience and the more times you've gone to do it? And has it really kind of changed your perception and what you care about when it comes to hunt tests and trials? Does that make sense?
Um, I'm not sure what you mean about care about.
Like skill set wise, like does it change anything to where, like if I'm hunting and I don't really necessarily use the steadiness example
Hmm.
earlier, like does it change your outlook on the steadiness requirements of a trial if when you go hunting and it's not necessary, it's like, well then why are we testing or trialing for this?
Oh, I see. So, yes, I think I have gotten more comfortable being uncomfortable. Like now, I mean, when I go out hunting, I have no problem going out by myself. I don't care. Um, but, 4 or 5 years ago, I wouldn't have done that. And I think that's just being more comfortable as a bird dog handler, knowing my dog, even now having a puppy, like knowing I can handle the dog and know kind of what to expect. I think with anything, the more you do it, the easier it gets, right? So, and I've had times where I went to my very first the training day. I went to my very first field trial, and you show up and you are that new person. Once you're the new person a couple times, like you said, it gets a little easier, right? So, yeah, I'm definitely more adventurous than I was before. In regards to caring about things, I I still, and I don't know if this would change if I like moved to a state where I could do a lot of wild bird hunting. But for me at this point in my life, I'm still very focused on tests and trials. Like with my, at least for, that's kind of like the ultimate goal, I guess. Like with my new puppy, I really want to get her on a lot of wild birds this winter. In a couple months, that is a priority for me for sure. But eventually, I do want to compete in high level field trials with her, and I really want her to do well, and probably will do upper level NAVDA testing as well. And that's more, at this point, that's more important to me than going out west or whatever and hunting.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Is obviously I've kind of traveled all over the country doing the hunting, and of course, that's still my first like passion and desire. But again, back to what we were talking about earlier, it's just like it's just not feasible where I'm at to where I can't spend months on the road
Yeah.
chasing wild birds with these dogs as much as I would love to. It's a lot of fun, but at the end of the day, like I can go join a trial or test and still be sleeping in my own bed that night. It just gives me something to do. It's a little bit more accommodating to the family life, the wallet for sure, just going down, having a little bit of fun and shooting back. And what I've found is like just because you trial the reason why I asked you that question earlier is like you can do this trialing game and hunting game and you can still maintain that level of standard of your choosing, right?
Yeah.
Like, I've had some people that do the high level testing that are hesitant to try NASTRA or UFTA because they don't want to mess up
Hmm.
the steadiness or the level of work. I'm like, well, then just don't allow it to happen, right? I still think that there's room in both of those shoot to retrieve games for high level dog work that you can still win. You probably need a couple like lucky things to happen to you a little bit for you on a brace, but I still think, and this is what I'm now focused on, is kind of being that generalist instead of the specialist to where I want the dogs and I'm trying to develop the dogs to where at any given weekend I can go hunt wild birds. The next weekend I can go do the shoot to retrieve trial, but then maybe the next weekend I'm doing a hunt test.
Hmm.
Maybe I'm not the best at any one of those things that we could possibly get to, but I think that you can do each one of those at a high level. And I kind of did that a little bit last year with Rachel specifically. Being older, Quinn was a puppy, is we were competitive in some shoot to retrieve trials. And I don't feel like it necessarily lost anything in terms of the higher level training. And so that's why I asked your question on that. Like some people just kind of get sour one way or the other. I'm like, it's really at the end of the day your choice still.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, one of the clubs that I've trained with, they run NASTRA trials. I did one kind of fun run, but I've never done like an official NASTRA event. But I've thought about it. Well, Zara had an injury this year, which kind of screwed everything up. But I thought maybe kind of when I retired her from AKC field trials, I'd try NASTRA, and I wouldn't be letting her break at the flush. I don't think I would. I think the only thing to think about is if you're competing in events where you have a brace mate that's maybe not trained at the level of your dog, that brace mate can potentially affect your dog's steadiness or obedience or whatever. If your dog, some dogs don't really, no, they don't care, but they're not quite as, if one dog is making a mistake, they're going to just stand there and be good. Whereas some dogs, if the brace mate's making a mistake, your dog might be like, okay, well, rules are gone now. We can just do whatever. So I think that's one thing to be cautious of. Yeah, I think being like talking about being a generalist, I mean, that's why I've done a lot of different stuff with Zara because if you only have one dog or a few dogs, you're not a professional that's got a whole kennel of 10 dogs. I think your dog has to be a little bit of a generalist if you want to do different stuff, right? I was, having one is different than having three, but I had one. So if I want to go hunting, I'm going to take her. If I want to go to a hunt test, I'm going to take her. If I want to go to a field trial, I'm going to take her, right? So, I think having a dog that can do a lot of stuff is A, possible, and B, the reality for a lot of people.
Do you think we're losing anything by not focusing on one? Because, I mean, like you said, you have some people that do field trials. They've been doing it for decades. Like, this is what they do. Kind of the same thing on the NAVDA people. It's like they almost have an assembly line of their dogs, so
Hmm.
to speak, to just kind of get them through the system. Do you think that you can kind of reach the pinnacle of any or all of them by focusing on so many different ones at the same time?
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot, especially with Zara, because we have done a lot of stuff and we've been fairly successful at a lot of it. Yeah, I think you probably lose something. I think, you know, if you have a field trial dog, that's all they've done their whole lives. They've run in the prairies in the summer for summer camp, and they come back. I think they probably have an edge. I think they probably do. Or if you have a dog that only does NAVDA and their obedience is very dialed in, and they are just, really, in, that's just their forte. Yeah, like seeing some of those dogs run at the Invitational, like it's just like smooth sailing, Whereas like I have a dog that's from field trial lines, so I think because of that, even though I went to field trials late, she was able to be okay at field trials because a lot of the genetics, and just being if you have a good dog that can get around clean and hunts well, you're gonna do okay. But sometimes when I was at NAVDA events, I felt like I just didn't have enough obedience because I let her range a little too much, or I just, I haven't quite put all that handle on that maybe some people have for NAVDA. So I think, yeah, maybe if you really focus on one or the other, you are at an advantage. But I think depending on the dog and the handler, I think you can do a lot of things. It's just, for me, it's been okay. I've just recognized, okay, we're just not going to be perfect at everything, and that's okay.
Yeah. I mean, it comes back down to your preference of dog, right? Because each one of these games is going to produce a kind of a different style dog. And I'm still, the jury is out with me personally on deciding whether or not that's an element of the actual game or just the type of handler that's attracted to those games, right?
Hmm.
And that's kind of where I come at, is at the end of the day is like I kind of believe that bird dogs are bird dogs. Different characteristics are more prone within the lines, obviously range and different drives and all the stuff that we talk about. But I still, like, there's a part of me, and there's still a lot of proven out left to do on this, but part of me really thinks that, like, if you go into it just trying to train the, quote unquote best bird dog you can, I think that they can be at the pinnacle of all of them. I haven't done it myself yet. I hope to, but I think it's possible because, to your point, like, you can go to NAVDA and there's more obedience, but you also do see the Zaras. You do see the rangier dogs. Like, it's still in there. So it's like, okay, well, maybe if I can just put more obedience on her,
Yeah.
without losing some of that hunt drive, she would be kind of on par with the other NAVTA dogs. And then vice versa, if you go to a horseback trial and you had the right genetics and you didn't really emphasize obedience so early on, they could be competitive in that game as well. Like, I think that if you go at it and that's your intention, is to be the quote unquote best at any game, I think that you can do it. And
Well, I think this goes back to the dogs knowing the context
yeah,
because, for example, when I was essentially and I think I did a podcast episode about this, about kind of separating seasons. But I was essentially running Zara and field trials at the same time I was training for NAVDA Invitational. But I'll handle her differently in the field at the Invitational than I did in a field trial. So, like, I would use my whistle a lot differently than I would in a field trial than I would in a NAVDA event. So I think, again, the dog learns the context, right? There's no horses at a NAVDA event. You're continually moving forward in a field trial. In NAVDA, you're kind of going around a field and then you're standing around the water buckets for 10 minutes. So
right.
it's a different context. So yeah, I think to your point, yeah, that I think you kind of got to be deliberate about some of it.
Yeah.
in your training.
So can you highlight some of those, the main difference, the main contextual differences between each one? Maybe not even so much from the dogs, but the handler, like you just said that you handled different in those environments, NAVDA versus a field trial. But talk about like the equipment and the different, like why are we handling them different? Because if it's me, if we're in a hunt test and NAVDA, it's like I look at it as like, well, just handle the dog appropriately as a bird dog, and then you could do that in the field trial. So, what is it about those games that require you to handle them different, aside from what you talked about in the horseback versus no horse, and then Nastra or Retrieve has side by sides and four wheelers out there. Like, besides those obvious things, what are you doing different as a handler?
And this would be primarily in the field, obviously, because hunt tests and field trials is only field
Yeah.
versus water work. Primarily to do with like range and pushing forward. So, like in an AKC field trial, you don't want your dog coming back to you, and you really don't want them going behind. Like you want them generally to be in front of you, which you do for the other stuff as well, like a hunt test or a NAVDA event. But I'm using my whistle to push her more in a hunt test. In a field trial. So, like if she's coming back to me, I'm going to use my whistle to push her out, like a kind of a go command. Whereas I probably wouldn't do that at a NAVDA test because then she's going to be too far away. So, I would still, like I have directional commands I give, like this way, that means kind of like come with me, but it doesn't mean come to me. I would use those in both. But and I would probably and obviously if you're going to compete in both those different worlds, your use of commands is a lot different, at least in regards to like bird work. So with field trials, I mean you can say whoa 5 to 10 times and the dog's on point. That's all right. If you say whoa 5 to 10 times at a NAVDA utility test or an invitational, like the judges are probably marking that every time you say whoa and your score is going to be docked. So you as a handler, if you're switching between events, you kind of have to have those rules in your mind so that you know what's okay and what's not at different events.
Even the equipment, because don't you have like a different collar
Oh yeah.
for trials and stuff like that for like healing them away or something like that?
Yeah. So like in a field trial or a hunt test, you typically running with what's called a flash collar, which is because you're in a brace. So you have the top dog is usually orange or pink, and then the bottom dog is yellow or green to tell the dogs apart. Because if they're 150 yards away and you have a white short hair and a white and brown short hair, it
Yeah,
can be
good
hard.
luck telling the difference.
Yeah, so that helps and helps you be able to see the dog. So that's not typically used in NAVDA. I mean, at the invitational, you're running braces. The other levels, you're not, obviously. But if they do have two similar dogs, because I was at the invitational last week volunteering, the judges will ask you to put on a flash collar to tell them apart, because sometimes it is difficult. So that's one little difference. And I actually used to run. I would run a flash collar on Zara in NAVDA because it made it easier to see her. It was really getting into the weeds, but NAVDA doesn't allow tracking collars. Field trials and hunt tests, most of them do, just as a kind of a backup to locate your dog if they get lost. You can't use it to tell if they're on point, but
Yeah.
that's.
I do find it interesting that NAVDA still hasn't allowed that to where like the other organizations, like you can put the tracking collar on and give the handheld to the judge or whatnot. I mean, even if they required like the prongs to be unscrewed from the collar, I'm surprised the tracking collar isn't allowed to in some way, because I've just been to too many NAVDA events where so many people are caught up on like, well, what if I lose my
Yeah.
dog? And I'm like, well, technically, like, if you're actually hunting, then, the dogs are going to be out and about. But when you're actually hunting, you have a tracking collar now.
Yeah,
So,
most people are probably hunting with a tracking collar.
yeah. What's a game that you haven't really participated in yet that kind of intrigues you, that you wish that you had the ability or you just haven't had time to get to it yet? But what's something that you actually do want to go try?
So, and I learned about this relatively recently, is the Versatile Hunting Dog Federation, VHDF. So their tests are kind of a little bit of a combination between NAVDA and the German testing system. So if you have a dog that's done well in NAVDA or the German testing system, you could probably do well in VHDF. So that intrigues me a lot. At least having a dog, like if I could take Zara to test like right now, like yeah, that's appealing. Whereas because I kind of already have a dog that would be ready for that in a sense. Training for that specifically the current puppy, I'm not sure if I'll do. Maybe not, like not right now, but eventually, yes, probably. So that's one thing I'm intrigued to learn more about. There's not one super close. Like Pennsylvania is the closest chapter, and I'm in North Carolina, so it's a little bit of a drive. But
Hmm.
I think they're growing. So yeah, maybe I'll check them out.
Yeah, I had them on a couple years ago, and after that, there's a few people kind of down here talking about trying to put on like the first Southern test
Mm-hmm.
or something on that. But obviously, that didn't. I don't think that went anywhere with anybody. But it's very similar to NAVD. It's almost just like a secondary option for it. So that's interesting. What about like cover dog trials? Have you thought about get? It's so hard to do down here because like how do we really prepare for that without
Yeah.
going and just spending a long extended time up there where there is a grouse population? Like how do you really actually prepare for that down here?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't really even know too much about cover dog trials, to be honest. So that maybe that'll be, something I'll have to explore with the next puppy. Because I do like the idea of running on either trials where the birds are pre-released, so they act semi-wild, or wild, which is obviously hard to find. But that does appeal to me. So
Yeah.
I probably will seek those opportunities out if I can find them.
Are you gonna go try your hand at any actual like wild bird trials like out west on the prairies, like the a sharp tail shoot or something like that?
I mean, maybe. I mean, if I've learned anything, it's like never say never,
Right.
because I never thought I'd be doing any of this. So maybe.
What about outside of the bird dog realm? Because you've done like fast cat and stuff like that. What are the benefits, if there are any, pros and cons to playing outside games that aren't hunting dog or bird dog specific?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of debate on that. I think there's definitely some people in the bird dog world who are like, you can never do barn hunt with your dog. You can never do fast cat with your dog. And I just don't believe that. Again, context. I think the dog can tell the difference. I think anytime you're training for something, whether it's conformation or dock diving or fast cat or obedience or any of these other sports, like you're spending time with your dog and you're building that bond. To me, like for the most part, that's only going to help your hunting or your bird dog adventures, right? So, I mean, a lot of people, especially if you're new or you're an amateur, like you probably don't have too many dogs. You have a couple dogs, one or two dogs, and you like to take them out in the world and do stuff with them. So you're not competing all the time. You're not hunting all the time. I'm a fan of doing a lot of other stuff.
I'm with you. I think anything that you spend time doing anything with your dog, it's a benefit to the relationship with that dog, which I think bleeds over into other areas, such as the tests and trials. I don't think it really inhibits you any way, shape, or form, unless like it's a direct contradiction to where it's like they're just sucked into your feet the whole time and then they won't
Sure.
go hunt. I think that's really the only big drawback to some of the stuff, to where I think when people start trying to do too many different types of things, it's like, there's so much reinforcement schedule right here at your feet that they almost kind of forget that there's stuff to be desired away from the handler and owner. I think that's the biggest balancing act for the average person with a bird dog. But other than that, like, go have fun with your dog. Whatever you want to do, just go do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because I don't know. As much as these dogs love to hunt, like they probably like to do other stuff too. It's okay to have off day where you go to the pond and practice your dock diving, right?
Right. Have you done the dock diving?
A little bit,
Okay.
yeah.
So that's something I haven't been to. I think it's just something fun to do in the off season. But even that, I've heard people say like, "Don't do that with your bird dogs." Like, why?
Oh,
What would?
I don't know. I'm not sure why they would say that unless they're thinking like because your dog is on a dock, but typically you could put them in a stay or a whoa, and then you walk to the end and throw something for them to retrieve. Oh, maybe because they're probably not retrieving to hand.
Maybe. I don't know. People have some crazy stuff. They also tell you never train your dog to sit, never play tug. I mean,
Yeah,
when you go down the never evers in bird dog
yeah,
world, we could spend all day, talking about whether it matters or not.
right.
But yeah, there's just a lot of fun games out there. But ultimately, it's interesting that I would say that what you do comes from an element of you prioritize and the dog work, the experience of the dog above everything else, and I do as well. And I just find it interesting that from the same lens of prioritizing the dog, that I'm like, hey, hunting comes first, and then you're testing and trialing, and then by necessity, I'm getting more involved in testing and trialing. It just goes to show that, like, no matter what brings you into this, there's an avenue for everybody in regards to this, but it's really just figuring out what you want to do with your dog and then pursuing it. Don't being afraid to try new things.
Yeah, definitely.
While we wrap this up, what is something I should have asked you about all this that I didn't?
I mean, just to go back to being a new person, like, I think you can't underestimate how, I think it's easy to forget, even both of us were, 10 years into bird dogs at least, right? So I think, I remember what it was like to be new, but I think you do still forget a lot.
You do.
And I think you really have to try to keep putting yourself back in the new person's shoes to help them, or just dumb it down sometimes to be like, because sometimes when I listen to, different podcasts, not necessarily yours, just the language people use when they're talking about it, like, it almost sounds intimidating, or just the way people talk about hunting, and you could have this about tests and trials too. There's just like a level of assumed knowledge that if you're like brand spanking new and listening to this, you're like, wait, like, what is steady to flush me, or like, some of
Right.
this terminology. I don't know. I think it's just something we should be cognizant about, and you know, to help encourage people to want to get involved if they're interested.
For sure. And we lied at the very start of this. You have been on this podcast before. You came on a couple years ago with Jim to talk about Bird Dog Society.
Yes.
And the reason why I bring that up is we were in your kitchen at the time recording,
Oh yes.
and that was like right before I was editing the rough grouse hunt film that I did with Larson. And you're watching that, and you said you had so many questions about leading up to the hunt, and then you kind of said something along those lines that really opened my eyes to where, like, something that came so second nature and obvious to me that I never even would have figured that somebody else would want to know that. Like, it was such at a beginner level. But it's a fair thing to say, because if you're brand new watching this, it's like, well, like, I don't even know how they got to this point of just walking into the woods.
Yeah.
But it's also challenging because it's hard to talk about anything to where if you never leave the beginning stages,
Sure.
there's not enough time on a podcast episode to, like, stop the conversation every time to provide clarification on what this terminology means. But what you say is, it's true. Like, if you want to attract new people, you kind of have to meet them where they're at and then bring them up. The challenge then becomes, like, the new people not wasting your time, but let's call it what it is, wasting your time. They claim that they want to do something that they don't actually want to do, but in their defense, they don't really know that they don't want to do it until they actually get involved into doing it.
Yeah, I think it's just something to be aware of. I mean, I love talking about advanced testing and training stuff. I mean, I'd rather talk about that than puppy stuff, honestly.
Yeah.
As we discussed previously, I'm not a puppy person, even though I have one right now.
Puppies are cute, but that wears off really quick.
Exactly. But I think, having, even if it's, just speaking from a specific podcast lens, if it's having a certain episodes that are like, this is for the beginners, or, one thing I've tried to do through my coaching with people is have resources for people that are brand new. And like, there is no dumb question. Like, you can ask me anything.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, people are asking, like you said, like, what's a premium? Like, where do I find that? Like, what website do I go to? The stuff that you're just like, oh, this is so obvious, but it's not.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's just, for people that, people like yourself that meet a lot of, newer people, just to kind of try to keep yourself in their shoes and be, welcoming and caring towards them, which I think, you are.
Well, it keeps us grounded,
Yeah.
right? And ultimately what we're talking about, going back to the premiums with the field trialer, is like, keep that in mind. that you and I do have the benefit of talking to a lot of new people. The vast majority of my questions aren't coming from the people that have been listening for 5 or 6 years because
Yeah.
they've heard all the same stuff I've had. It's coming from the people that are brand new and they're asking genuine questions. So I can start kind of, hey, if I'm getting this specific question a lot, there needs to be some more clarity on this. There needs to
Mhm.
be some more access to information such as this. And I think, when I'm talking to people, and this goes beyond just the trialing and recruitment, but, the conservation space, it's, you know, people such as us that have the privilege of talking to new people. We have that perspective that maybe a lot of other people kind of lose sight of because they're kind of only dealing with the people that have been doing it for 10, 20, 30 years. And it is important that if you want to grow the culture and you want to grow the community like everybody claims they want to, then you need to be making it to where the new person at least has the path to understand how to do it. And that's my biggest thing, is to circle back and not to beat a dead horse, but like, if you want people to show up to your trial, actually make it to where people can find the trial.
Yeah.
Like, that's the step one.
Right. Or yeah, I mean, because even like picking on NAVDA again, I feel like NAVDA chapters. I don't know if I've seen this on like every NAVDA website, but I feel like sometimes you see something that's like, if you're new, come out. Like you're welcome.
Yeah.
New people are welcome. You can always come to the test, or even if people don't know that, like that's usually the case, right? You can
Hmm.
always show up to a test and spectate. I feel like that's a little bit less advertised in the hunt test and field trial world.
Absolutely.
So when I try to help people spectate an event, if it's not something I'm going to be at, I always say, reach out to the secretary, email them and say, hey, I want to come. Like, what time should I be there? Where should I go? That sort of thing. Just so they just don't show up and they're like, who are you?
Right.
You want to avoid that. So,
Yeah. One last thing that we have to touch on before we wrap this up is that if anybody's listening to this and kind of your backstory, the high notes that you kind of gave us, or your perspectives, if they want to have a little bit more context, you uh, suffered through writing a book recently. I want to hear that experience. What made you want to write a book? And then talk to me about, like, actually sitting down and writing the book, because you hear a lot of people saying, I'm going to write a book, and then they never actually do it. So, like, what posed you, like, what motivated you to actually write one?
um, so anyone that knows me or, knows a little bit about me, I mean, obviously Zara, my Vizsla, has changed my life essentially. So that was the motivation. I mean, just having that. I don't know, I just wanted to share the story with people because as much as you can share on social media or podcasts, like it's snippets, right? To kind of, I don't know. I've always loved to read. I love to write, and I just felt like it was something that I wanted to do and needed to be done. Um, Writing it was really not difficult, honestly. I wrote it over the course of a year. I started in 2020, so it's been a while since I really wrote the bulk of it. Since it's a memoir and a lot of it is like I was recounting stuff that happened, it was not like I was making stuff up per se. Like it's not like I was writing a novel. So that wasn't really the hard part. Getting it out in the world was more of the hard part.
Mm.
So publishing a book is, you can get it written and even get it edited, which is can be a pain because there's a lot of back and forth, and that's the harder part, right? They say write a bad first draft. Once you got a bad first draft, you can work with that. But editing can be challenging because if I worked with an editor. Who's a friend of mine, and she would challenge me on things, and it's like, oh, now I got to go back and like think about how to deal with this, right, to make it better. But that did make it better.
Yeah.
So, and then the whole publishing process, I ended up self-publishing, which has meant all the work was on me. So, figuring all that out was a fair amount of effort. But it was just. I guess since I did start this in 2020, it's finally been published in 2024. It just got to the point where I was like, I've been sitting on this thing for so long. Like, I've just got to get this gosh
Throw
darn
it
thing
out
out in the
there.
world. Like, this is just, it just needs to be done. So,
Yeah. 2020 to 2024, it's a lot of time to create new memories, though. Are you already thinking about compiling the new stories for book number two, or are you just like, hey, let's see how this first one goes?
so, when you read the book, you have a copy now. It does cover up to almost to 2024. Just a
Okay.
spoiler alert, somewhat. But yes, I do have more books in me. I think I have a rough idea for one. It's going to be a little bit of time before that happens, I think, and it'll probably be different than this one, a different style. But yeah.
Yeah. It's really cool. I like people following through and just doing cool, creative things, whether it's a podcast, a video, a book. I'm an advocate, and I've been outspoken on this to where I believe in valuable content, more valuable content that you can rely on in the space. I think is a net win for all of us, and so I'm glad that you did that for people that are interested. Aside from the link that's going to be in the show notes, if you want to click on it, where can people go find it?
So you can either just search it on Amazon. It's available in paperback or ebook. Or if you want an autographed copy, you can go to my website, which is accidentalbirddog.com/book is the direct link. And then you
Okay.
can order one from me directly.
And the book is Accidental Bird Dog.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. I'm glad that we were able to do this. Maybe next time it's not going to be 100 degrees outside, and maybe you can have your dogs, and we can go chase some woodcock or something. But
Yep.
it's we've spent a little time offline that we've never really sat down and done a one-on-one podcast though. So thanks for joining me, and yeah, everybody hit subscribe and check the next episode out.
Yes. Thank you, Nick.